When I discovered our HOA president had hired a fake police force with K-9 units to frighten residents, I knew I had to act fast before someone got hurt. But I never expected my dad, the chief of police, to uncover a web of dishonesty that would shake our entire community to its core. What would you do if you found out the people claiming to protect your neighborhood were actually criminals with badges? Welcome to my channel. Comment below where you're watching from. The bright orange paper waving on my front door stopped me in my tracks after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. All I wanted was to surprise Sarah by helping with her new vegetable garden, but that notice changed everything. My hands shook as I read the words "urgent action needed" stamped across the top in bold black letters. I'd heard stories about Barbara Thompson, our HOA president, from other neighbors. She'd moved in 6 months ago and somehow got herself chosen within weeks. The way she wrote our address on the violation notice, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the paper, told me everything I needed to know about her character. Unapproved landscaping adjustments found in backyard space. The notice read, "Immediate removal needed. All garden installations must undergo proper HOA review process." At the bottom, Barbara's signature sprawled across the page like she was signing a royal decree. But it was the last line that made my stomach tighten. "Security will conduct routine inspections to ensure compliance." Since when did our quiet suburban community need security inspections for vegetable gardens? Sarah and I had moved here 3 months ago, drawn by the friendly neighbors and peaceful streets. Mrs. Patterson next door had even brought us homemade cookies to welcome us. Now, this thought I pulled out my phone and took pictures of both sides of the notice. Something about the wording felt odd, like it was trying too hard to sound official. I'd learned from my dad to always document everything just in case. Being the son of a police chief teaches you a few things about dealing with authority, real or fraudulent. Inside, I found Sarah singing in the kitchen, soil still fresh under her fingernails from working in our small garden. Her smile faded as I handed her the notice. "But we checked the HOA rules," she said, pulling up the community website on her tablet. Right here, Article 7. Vegetable gardens allowed in backyard spaces with proper drainage. That I watched as she highlighted the relevant sections, her environmental lawyer instincts kicking in. We'd done everything right, installed proper drainage, kept it small and neat, even used the recommended height for raised beds. The tomato plants were barely visible from any angle outside our yard. The doorbell rang, making us both flinch. Through the peephole, I saw Barbara herself, tapping her foot impatiently on our welcome mat. She wore a crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, a tablet clutched in her manicured hands like a tool. "That I want to make sure you receive my notice," she announced when I opened the door, not bothering with a greeting. Her eyes darted past me, trying to peek inside our house. "The board has received reports about your agricultural activities. Would you mind showing me these reports?" I asked calmly, remembering Dad's advice about staying professional in tense situations. "And could you clarify which specific HOA rules we violated?" Barbara's face stiffened. "Our new security team will be documenting all violations starting tomorrow. I suggest you comply quickly to avoid problems." She turned on her heel, but not before I noticed something unusual, a logo on her tablet case that looked suspiciously like a police badge. I closed the door. Sarah was already pulling up property maps and local ordinances on her laptop. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to the HOA board meeting minutes from last month. They never voted on hiring any security team. Where is she getting the authority for this? I stared out our kitchen window at the neat rows of vegetables Sarah had lovingly planted. Something bigger was happening here, and that orange notice was just the beginning. I picked up my phone to call Dad, then stopped. Maybe it was too soon to involve him. But as I watched Barbara stride down our street, stopping to take photos of other homes with her tablet, I couldn't shake the feeling that our quiet community was about to transform forever. I was drinking my morning coffee when I first spotted them through our kitchen window. 2 men in black polo shirts with HOA security printed on the back were taking photos of our vegetable garden. Their movements were different from regular HOA inspectors, more intense, more purposeful. What really caught my eye were the tactical belts they wore, loaded with what looked like real police gear. Sarah was still asleep upstairs when I stepped onto our back porch. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the unease growing in my stomach. The taller one turned, hand resting on what appeared to be a real police-issue taser. His partner kept photographing our tomato plants like they were evidence at a crime scene. "We have police authority within this community," the tall one said, flashing a badge that looked official but disappeared too quickly for me to read it. "We're documenting ongoing violations under HOA Code 47B. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to not being questioned. I pulled out my phone and started recording, which made them both visibly uncomfortable. "I'd like to see your credentials and documentation of this police authority," I said, remembering the legal rights pamphlet I'd read just last week. The shorter one stepped forward, but his partner held him back. That's when Barbara Thompson appeared as if she'd been waiting in the shadows. She marched across our lawn in her designer workout gear, waving another orange violation notice. "These officers don't answer to residents," she announced, clearly enjoying the drama. "They report directly to the HOA Executive Board, which means they report to me." I noticed our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, peeking through her curtains. When our eyes met, she quickly disappeared, but not before I saw the worry on her face. Something about that look made my skin crawl. Later that morning, while reviewing my phone footage, I noticed details I'd missed in the moment. The officers had no name tags. Their badges didn't match any local law enforcement design I'd ever seen, and the equipment on their belts, it looked real, but something was off about the positioning. I spent my lunch break researching private security regulations in our state. Every legitimate company needed specific licenses and permits, especially if they were carrying weapons. The HOA newsletter had mentioned hiring enhanced security, but there was no company name, no license numbers, nothing that could be verified. Sarah came downstairs just as I was emailing the state licensing board. "Why are there men with weapons taking pictures of our garden?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I showed her the footage from that morning, and her face went pale. "Those aren't regular security guards," she said, her voice low but firm. "I used to work at a security company. Remember, their gear is all wrong." We watched through our windows as the officers moved down the street, stopping at each house with careful precision. They spent extra time at the homes of residents who'd spoken up at recent HOA meetings. The Rodriguez family, who'd complained about unfair enforcement of noise regulations. The Smiths, who'd questioned the new security fee on their monthly statement. That evening, I created a private group chat with trusted neighbors. Messages started pouring in immediately. The security team had been entering backyards without permission. They'd been taking photos of children playing. They'd even threatened to detain someone for washing their car in their own driveway. As I compiled everyone's stories and evidence, my phone buzzed with a text for Barbara. "Your continued monitoring of our security team is a violation of HOA policy. Expect enforcement action tomorrow." The threat was clear, but she'd made a crucial mistake. In trying to scare us, she confirmed what we suspected. These men weren't real police officers at all. I looked at Sarah, who was already pulling up the state's laws about impersonating law enforcement. "We need to be really cautious," she whispered. "If they're willing to pretend to be cops, who knows what else they're willing to do?" The growing stack of evidence on our kitchen table suggested we'd only uncover the surface of what was really going on in our neighborhood. My phone buzzed during a crucial work meeting. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. She never calls during work hours. Something was wrong. I stepped out, my hands already clammy as I answered. "They're in our backyard," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "3 of them. They jumped our fence while I was picking tomatoes." I heard male voices in the background, stern and demanding. My wife's breathing got faster through the phone. I could hear heavy boots on our wooden deck. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Exit the garden now." The voice was trying to sound official, but there was something off about it. "We have authorization to remove you by force." "I'm not leaving my own property," Sarah said boldly, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "Show me your real police badges or leave now." The sound of a radio crackling made my stomach drop. "Unit 2, subject is non-compliant. Requesting K9 backup at 1242 Maple Drive." I was already running to my car, my tie flapping in the wind. "Sarah, I'm on my way. Don't move. Call 911 right now. These aren't real cops." Through the phone, I heard Barbara's sharp voice. Mrs. Williams, your garden is a direct violation of HOA Aesthetic Guidelines, Section 4.3. My security team has full authority to remove unauthorized plantings and trespassers. Trespassers, Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. I live here, and those tomato plants are in our backyard. I put the phone on speaker as I sped home, breaking every speed limit. Sarah kept the line open, and each sound made my heart race faster. The click of a weapon being unfastened. Heavy footsteps approaching. Barbara's self-satisfied voice listing violations. Look what I found, one of the security men said. Hispanic-style peppers. Definitely not approved vegetation. They're jalapenos, Sarah yelled. Since when do vegetables have ethnic restrictions? I heard our garden gate creak, the one I'd installed just last weekend. More boots on gravel. Someone yanking at plants. Stop touching our property, Sarah shouted. My husband's already called the real police. Barbara's laugh sent chills down my spine. Dear, we are the police in this community. The HOA charter gives us full authority. Now step aside, or my men will remove you. The sound of a dog barking in the distance made my blood run cold. They were really bringing in K-9 units for a vegetable garden dispute. I switched lanes aggressively, drawing angry honks. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes. This is what happens when you ignore warnings, Barbara said. First the unapproved plants, then the unauthorized garden stakes, and now resisting HOA security. You people need to learn respect for authority. You people. Sarah's voice was quiet but strong. I heard her phone camera clicking. Please say that again, Barbara. I'm recording everything. The sound of hurried footsteps. Barbara's sharp intake of breath. Confiscate that phone. It's against HOA policy to record security operations. I heard Sarah scream as someone grabbed at her. The phone clattered to the ground but stayed connected. Through the speaker, I heard the deep growl of a large dog growing louder. Barbara Thompson, Sarah shouted. If that dog touches me, you'll be in handcuffs before sunset. I was 2 blocks away when I heard sirens, but they weren't coming from the direction of the local police station. A black SUV with K-9 unit markings screeched to a halt in front of our house. The fake police force was escalating, but they had no idea they were about to meet a real chief of police. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I'd seen power-hungry HOA boards before, but this was something else entirely. As I turned onto our street, I saw the crowd gathering. Neighbors with phones raised, recording everything. Barbara's security team had finally gone too far, and now everyone would see exactly who they really were. My tires screeched as I pulled into our driveway, and what I saw made my heart stop. Sarah was backed against our front door, her gardening gloves still on, dirt smudged on her cheek. 3 men in tactical gear had formed a half circle around her while Barbara stood off to the side with a clipboard, writing furiously. But what really made my hands shake was the German Shepherd pulling hard against its leash, teeth bared. The handler, a guy who looked barely old enough to drink, was struggling to control the dog. These weren't just rent-a-cops playing dress-up anymore. This was dangerous. Step back inside your vehicle, sir, one of the security officers ordered, trying to sound official. His hand rested on what looked like a real police belt, but something was off about his badge. I'd grown up around real police equipment thanks to Dad, and this wasn't it. Barbara's face lit up with that familiar, overconfident smile when she saw me. Perfect timing. Your wife has been interfering with official HOA security operations. She waved her clipboard like it was some kind of royal decree. We have documented 17 violations, including aggressive behavior toward our officers. I took out my phone and started recording. Barbara's smile faltered for a split second. Putting unauthorized recordings on social media is against HOA guidelines, she snapped, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Funny thing about those guidelines, I said, keeping my voice steady like Dad taught me. I've read them cover to cover. Nowhere does it mention a private police force or K-9 units. The youngest officer shifted uneasily, his hand dropping from his belt. Sarah caught my eye, and I gave her a slight nod. She'd been recording too, her phone partially hidden by her gardening apron. We talked about this possibility after the first time these guys showed up, and now our security cameras were catching everything from 3 different angles. "This is your final warning," Barbara declared, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Remove the unauthorized vegetables immediately, or we will be forced to take additional enforcement action." The German Shepherd barked, making Sarah jump. That's when I noticed something that made my blood boil. The dog's vest said Police K-9, a federal offense if they weren't actual law enforcement. I could almost hear Dad's voice in my head, listing all the laws they were breaking. "Barbara," I said calmly, pulling up the state police department's website on my phone. "Did you know impersonating law enforcement officers is a felony? Those uniforms, that dog's vest, those fake badges, each one is a separate charge." The security team started exchanging nervous glances. The dog handler's grip on the leash tightened, his knuckles turning white. Barbara's face flushed red, but she kept writing on her clipboard like it was some kind of shield. "We have full authority to enforce HOA regulations," she insisted, but her voice wavered. "The board approved everything." "Really?" I reached into my car and pulled out the folder I'd been collecting. "Because I have here the minutes from every board meeting for the past year. Nowhere does it mention hiring armed security or approving K-9 units." I turned to the youngest officer. "By the way, what's your certification number for handling that police dog?" The handler's face went pale. The German Shepherd, picking up on his anxiety, started whining. Barbara's pen froze mid-sentence on her clipboard. "Sarah," I called out, keeping my eyes on the security team, "could you grab Dad's car from my wallet? I think he'd be very interested in seeing these gentlemen's law enforcement credentials." That's when Barbara made her biggest mistake. "Detain them both," she shouted, her clipboard clattering to the ground. "They're threatening HOA personnel." My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to type out a quick text to my dad. "Emergency at house. Fake cops threatening Sarah with dog. Please help." I kept my phone low, pretending to check my work schedule while Barbara ranted about our garden violating some fabricated rule about aesthetic cohesion. The lead security guy kept his hand on the German Shepherd's harness, making sure we could see how eager the dog was to lunge forward. Sarah stood her ground, but I could see her terror. She'd been bitten by a dog as a kid and never quite got over that fear. That's exactly what these bullies were counting on. I checked my phone every few seconds, trying not to be obvious. Dad had read my message. 3 dots appeared as he typed. My heart was racing. In 20 years as chief of police, he'd seen every kind of scam and power trip imaginable. But this was personal. Barbara was getting louder, waving some kind of official-looking document in Sarah's face. "As per Section 8, Paragraph 12 of our Enhanced Security Protocols," she started, but I cut her off. "Could you show me where the HOA board approved these protocols?" I asked calmly. That threw her for a loop. The security team leader, his fake badge reading Captain Reynolds, stepped forward. "Sir, you're interfering with a sanctioned HOA operation," he growled, letting the dog pull forward just a little bit more. I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. These guys were amateurs playing dress-up, but that made them even more unpredictable. Just then, I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Barbara was too busy reading from her rulebook to notice, but Captain Reynolds' head snapped up. He knew that sound meant trouble. The other 2 security guys started shifting nervously. The sirens got louder. One of the fake officers touched his earpiece, probably just for appearance since I doubted they could afford real radio equipment. "Maybe we should," he started to say, but Barbara whirled on him. "Don't you dare back down now. I'm paying you good money to show these people who's in charge." That's when the first real police car rounded the corner, lights flashing. Then another, and another. The look on Barbara's face was priceless as 5 patrol cars surrounded my house, cutting off any escape route. The German Shepherd, sensing the shift in power, sat down and whined. Dad stepped out of the lead car, and I've never been so proud to be his son. He wasn't wearing his usual business suit. He was in full chief of police uniform, badge shining under the sunlight. He had clearly been in a meeting when he got my text, but he didn't waste a second responding. "Barbara Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying that special tone that only comes from decades of real police work. "I'm Chief Anderson. Would you care to explain why you have unauthorized personnel posing as law enforcement officers on private property?" Barbara's face went through about 5 different emotions in 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, fear, anger, and finally panic. She looked at me, then at Dad, then back at me. The pieces clicked together in her head. The security team tried to back away, but Dad's officers had already formed a perimeter. The German Shepherd, proving it had more sense than its handlers, lay down and wagged its tail at the real police K-9 unit that had just arrived. "I can explain everything," Barbara stammered, but Dad held up his hand. "I'm sure you can, ma'am. We'll have plenty of time for that down at the station. Right now, I'm more interested in where these gentlemen got their badges and credentials." He turned to the fake security team. "Speaking of which, those badges look remarkably similar to official police identification. That's a federal offense, gentlemen." As Dad's officers began taking statements and collecting proof, neighbors started peeking out of their houses. Some had phones out, recording everything. Barbara's little empire of fear was crumbling, and the whole community was watching it happen. I pulled Sarah close, feeling her finally relax as the real police took control of the situation. "Your dad," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "He didn't just bring backup. He brought justice." The screech of police sirens filled our street as my dad's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Barbara's smirk vanished when she saw the chief of police emblem on the door. I'll never forget how her face changed from confident to terrified in seconds. Dad stepped out, his police uniform catching the afternoon sun. The fake security team's German Shepherd suddenly sat quiet, as if it knew a real leader had arrived. 20 years as chief of police had given my father a presence that no fake badge could match. "I'd like to see your security licenses and K-9 unit certifications," Dad said calmly, his voice carrying across our front yard. The 3 security officers looked at each other, their tough guy act crumbling. The one holding the dog's leash started backing away. Barbara jumped in, waving a folder of papers. "We have all the necessary HOA authorizations right here," she said, her voice higher than usual. "These officers are fully within their rights to enforce our community guidelines." Dad took the folder, but didn't open it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Barbara something on the screen. "Interesting," he said, "because according to state records, there's no licensed security company registered under your HOA's name. And that K-9 unit, the closest authorized police dog training facility, hasn't certified any private security dogs in 2 years." The color drained from Barbara's face. The security team leader, a tall man with a buzzed cut who'd been so intimidating moments before, now couldn't seem to look anyone in the eye. 2 real police officers approached him, and I noticed his hand trembling as he tried to keep hold of the dog's leash. "Sir," one of Dad's officers said, "that's department-issued gear you're wearing. Mind telling me where you got it?" The security team leader remained silent, sweat visible on his forehead. More neighbors had gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold. I saw phones recording everything. Sarah squeezed my hand as Dad walked over to the security team's car, shining his flashlight through the windows. "Well, what do we have here?" Dad called out. In the back seat were folders with photos, dozens of them, pictures of families in their backyards, children playing, residents simply living their lives. My stomach turned as I realized how long they'd been watching us all. Barbara tried to slip away during the commotion, but a young officer blocked her path. "Ma'am, impersonating law enforcement officers is a federal offense," he said, "and using an unauthorized K-9 unit to threaten civilians, that's going to require some explaining." The dog, seeming to sense its handler's distress, had gone from aggressive to confused. A real K-9 unit arrived, and the difference was obvious. The HOA's dog had none of the discipline or training of a real police dog. Dad turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors. "If anyone has had encounters with these individuals, we'll need statements," he announced. Hands shot up across the street. The Rodriguez family from next door stepped forward first, then the Patels from across the street. "They threatened to have my children removed by social services for playing basketball in our driveway," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice shaking with anger and relief. As real police officers began taking testimonies, I watched Barbara sink into the back of a patrol car, still clutching her HOA rule book. The security team was being cuffed, their fake badges and gear confiscated. Their German Shepherd, now revealed as just an untrained dog used to frighten people, was being gently led away by the real K-9 unit officer. Sarah walked over to my dad, giving him a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. Dad just nodded, but I could see the anger in his eyes as he looked through more of the surveillance photos from the security team's car. A news van pulled up at the end of our street. Barbara saw it through the patrol car window and finally broke down crying. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who was finally facing consequences for their actions. Real justice was about to begin, and our peaceful community would never be the same. As more officers arrived, the reality of the situation sank in for everyone watching. The fake security team, once so confident in their authority, now looked like helpless criminals waiting to be processed. Dad's officers secured all the confiscated gear, including the fake police badges, the tactical belts, and the unauthorized radio equipment. A crime scene photographer snapped pictures of everything, documenting every detail. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Sarah stayed close to me, her breathing still unsteady. I could tell she was still processing everything that had just happened, from being threatened in our own yard to watching Barbara and her team get arrested. The HOA had ruled this neighborhood like a private kingdom for too long, but now it was all crumbling. The lead officer who had taken Barbara into custody returned to my dad's side. "We ran the names of these so-called officers," he said, shaking his head. "3 of them have outstanding warrants for fraud, and one of them has been impersonating police for over a year." Dad's jaw clenched, his patience wearing thin. "This isn't just a power-hungry HOA," he muttered. "This is an organized operation." My phone buzzed with messages from our neighbors' group chat. People were sharing their own horror stories: false fines, illegal property searches, intimidation tactics used to silence anyone who questioned Barbara's authority. It was clear now that this wasn't about enforcing community rules. It was about control. Sarah pulled out the HOA's financial reports she had downloaded earlier and scrolled through them quickly. "Look at this," she said, showing me the numbers. "The security budget increased by $30,000 in 6 months, but there's no record of any payments made to a licensed company. That money went somewhere, and I have a feeling it wasn't used for security upgrades." I turned to Dad, relaying what Sarah had found. He nodded grimly and waved over another officer. "Get a search warrant for the HOA office and Barbara's personal records," he ordered. "If this goes deeper, I want to know how far." The neighbors around us, once hesitant to speak out, were now energized by what they were seeing. Mrs. Patel, who had always been careful about publicly opposing the HOA, stepped forward. "What happens to the HOA now?" she asked, her voice steady. My dad looked around at the concerned faces of the homeowners, then at the patrol cars lined up along the street. "That depends on you," he said. "If enough of you vote to dissolve it, the HOA's power is gone." A murmur spread through the crowd. The idea of finally being free from Barbara's reign was something none of them had considered a real possibility until now. Sarah and I exchanged a look. We had fought back, and we had won, but this was just the beginning of rebuilding our neighborhood into something better. For the first time since moving in, I felt hopeful about the future of our community. The fear that had loomed over us for months was finally lifting, replaced with a sense of unity among the neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak. The reality of Barbara's downfall was sinking in as officers continued collecting evidence, interviewing residents, and processing the fraudulent security team. The sun was setting by the time the last of the officers wrapped up their statements. Dad stayed behind, speaking with Sarah and me near the patrol cars. "This isn't over yet," he said, his expression serious. "The investigation will take time, and Barbara isn't the only one involved in this. HOA corruption runs deeper than most people realize." Sarah nodded, her lawyer instincts already kicking in. "We'll make sure the board is held accountable," she said. "They signed off on everything Barbara did, and they profited from it too." Dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The fraud charges alone could put her away for years, but I have a feeling this is bigger than just her. We'll dig until we find the truth." The crowd of neighbors had gathered closer, listening intently. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been one of Barbara's most vocal critics, stepped forward with determination in her eyes. If we have the power to dissolve the HOA, we need to do it now, she said. This neighborhood was supposed to be a home, not a dictatorship. A few others murmured in agreement, and soon a ripple effect spread through the crowd. The once fearful homeowners now stood together, talking about filing legal actions, voting for change, and taking their community back. Sarah pulled up the HOA's bylaws on her tablet, scrolling quickly. If we gather enough signatures, we can force a dissolution vote, she said. If the majority agrees, we can dismantle the entire HOA structure and put a real neighborhood association in place, one that actually listens to its residents. The excitement grew as more people stepped up, eager to sign. It was the first time I had ever seen this community feel like a real family instead of a collection of people afraid of fines and threats. The fake security team had been loaded into the patrol cars, their arrogant postures now replaced with defeat. Barbara sat in the back of a squad car, staring blankly at the house she had ruled over for so long. Her rule was over, and she knew it. Dad checked his phone and exhaled slowly. Search warrant just got approved for the HOA office, he said. We'll find out exactly where that missing money went. Sarah squeezed my hand, a small smile forming on her face. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder, watching as neighbors continued signing their names, reclaiming their power. This fight had been exhausting, but as I looked around, I knew one thing for sure. We weren't just winning. We were rebuilding something better. As the night settled in, I realized this was only the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. The flashing police lights cast a blue-red glow over the neighborhood as officers continued wrapping up the investigation. The once feared HOA security team was gone, their fake badges and uniforms confiscated, their fabricated authority completely shattered. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak now gathered in groups, discussing the future of the community. Sarah and I stood side by side, watching as people who had barely spoken before were now bonding over shared relief. Mrs. Patel approached with a clipboard, her face determined. We have enough signatures for the dissolution vote, she said, handing the papers to Sarah. We need to make it official at the next HOA meeting. Sarah took the clipboard, scanning the names. This was happening faster than I had expected. The entire neighborhood was rising against Barbara's oppressive rule, and the momentum was unstoppable. My dad walked over, his face calmer now that things were under control. The fraud investigation is officially open, he said. Barbara and her board members are being questioned separately. Once we go through the financial records, we'll know exactly how deep this goes. Sarah exhaled, her grip tightening around my hand. It was finally over. Barbara's control, the intimidation, the false police force. It had all collapsed in a single evening. But as I looked at the neighbors, their hopeful expressions, I knew the real work was just beginning. This community had to rebuild itself from the ground up, and that would take time. My dad placed a hand on my shoulder. You and Sarah did good tonight, he said. I nodded, but before I could respond, one of his officers approached with a serious expression. Chief, we just got access to the HOA office records. You're going to want to see this. My dad took the folder, flipping through the pages. His brows furrowed as he read, his mouth tightening. What is it? I asked, glancing at Sarah. He turned the folder so we could see. Hidden among the financial documents were invoices for security services that had never been rendered, money transfers to offshore accounts, and even signed approvals from Barbara under false names. This wasn't just HOA corruption. It was organized fraud on a level that could lead to federal charges. Sarah's jaw clenched. She had suspected financial misconduct, but this was far worse. We need to get this to a judge, my dad said. With this level of fraud, there's a good chance Barbara and her people won't just be facing fines. They'll be seeing prison time. A murmur went through the neighbors as news spread about the financial scandal. The HOA wasn't just abusive. It had been stealing from them for years. I glanced at Barbara, who sat in the back of a squad car, her usual arrogant demeanor replaced with defeat. For the first time since we moved here, the neighborhood was free and justice was finally being served. As Sarah and I walked home, I knew this fight had changed us forever. The tension that had hung over our neighborhood for months had finally lifted. but in its place was a sense of urgency to rebuild what had been broken. The community had come together in a way none of us had expected, and as we passed each house, we saw groups of neighbors still talking, still planning, still ready to make a real difference. Sarah exhaled slowly as we stepped inside, locking the door behind her. "I can't believe it's over," she said, her voice filled with exhaustion. I pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of the night finally settling in. "We fought back," I whispered, "and we won." She nodded against my shoulder, but I could tell she was still processing everything. I wasn't sure if either of us would fully understand how much this battle had changed us until we had some distance from it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a message from my dad. "HOA office raided this morning. Dozens of fraudulent transactions confirmed. FBI taking over the case." I sat up quickly, rereading the text. This was bigger than I had imagined. I turned to Sarah, who was already awake, scrolling through news articles on her phone. "It's everywhere," she said, showing me the screen. Local news had picked up the story. Photos of Barbara in handcuffs, interviews with neighbors who had been victimized, and discussions about HOAs abusing their power were spreading fast. "This isn't just our neighborhood's fight anymore," she said. "This is going to change how people see HOAs across the country." My phone buzzed again, this time from our community group chat. Messages flooded in. People thanking each other, organizing meetings, discussing new leadership. The HOA wasn't officially dissolved yet, but its grip was gone. No one feared Barbara anymore. I stretched, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. "We should go to the meeting tonight," Sarah said. "It's time to make sure the right people take over." I nodded, already knowing she was right. Just because the worst was over didn't mean the fight was. We had worked too hard to let things slip back into corruption. That evening, we walked to the community center, expecting a small gathering. Instead, the place was packed. Neighbors filled every seat, standing along the walls, some even watching from outside the open doors. At the front of the room, Mrs. Patel stood beside a stack of petitions. "We have enough votes," she announced, her voice steady. "The HOA is officially dissolved." A cheer erupted from the crowd, the sound of a community reclaiming its freedom. Sarah squeezed my hand as we watched the celebration unfold. We had come here looking for a fresh start, and now, finally, we had one. This was more than just a victory. It was the beginning of something better. The neighborhood had come together in ways none of us had expected, and as the cheers settled, a sense of unity remained. People who had once been too afraid to speak up now stood side by side, making plans for a future without fear. Sarah and I moved through the crowd, listening to conversations about rebuilding, about fairness, about ensuring this never happened again. Mrs. Patel, now surrounded by neighbors, was already discussing the formation of a resident-run association, one without unchecked power. The weight of what we had accomplished began to truly settle in. Sarah leaned against me, her shoulders finally relaxing after weeks of stress. "I'm proud of us," she whispered. I squeezed her hand, feeling the same way. The fight had been long, but had been worth every struggle. As we left the community center that night, the air felt lighter. No more threats, no more fear, just a fresh start. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I watched as neighbors greeted each other with real smiles, not the forced politeness they used to wear under Barbara's rule. The difference was obvious. It was a community again. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from my dad. Final update. Barbara and her board members facing multiple felony charges. Investigation expanding. I exhaled, shaking my head. It wasn't just a case of HOA abuse. It was a criminal operation, and now justice was finally being served. Sarah stepped outside, stretching in the morning sunlight. "Any news?" she asked, eyeing my phone. I showed her the message, and she nodded, a small smile on her lips. "It's over," she said, and this time it really felt like it. We spent the day helping neighbors tear down the ridiculous HOA signs Barbara had posted everywhere. No more security warnings. No more surveillance notices. Just people reclaiming their homes. It was strange how something as simple as removing a sign could feel so freeing. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah and I sat on our porch, watching kids play in the street without fear of being fined or scolded. This is what we fought for, I thought. Not just the end of a corrupt HOA, but the return of something that had been missing: peace. As Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, I realized that we had found something even more valuable than justice. We had found belonging. We had fought for our home, and now it finally felt like one. The fear that had ruled this neighborhood was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging we had never truly felt before. As I sat on the porch, sipping my coffee, I watched neighbors chatting freely, no longer looking over their shoulders. Kids rode their bikes without worrying about ridiculous fines. Families tended to their gardens without the threat of inspections, and for the first time since we moved in, I felt at ease. Sarah stepped outside, stretching as she took in the peaceful scene. "It feels different," she said, smiling. "It really does." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. It wasn't just about Barbara being gone or the fake security team being arrested. It was about something much bigger. People had stood up, fought back, and taken their community into their own hands. The scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but they no longer defined us. My phone buzzed with a message from my dad. "Thought you'd like to know, the fraud charge is stuck. Barbara isn't getting out anytime soon." I exhaled, feeling the last bit of tension release from my body. Justice had been served. Sarah glanced at my phone and smiled. "Good," she said. "She deserves every bit of it." As the sun set over our quiet street, I realized that this wasn't just about taking down a corrupt HOA. It was about reclaiming the freedom to live without fear, without intimidation, without someone constantly trying to control us. We had fought for our rights, for our neighbors, for our peace. And in the end, we had won.